Hello there, and welcome. Go ahead and find your comfortable place to rest. You can let your body begin to settle, and let the day you've just had begin to fade. Tonight, we're not going to start with an idea in your own mind. We're going to start with a place. A real place from a very long time ago. I want you to imagine the city of Athens, around the year 400 BC. We often picture ancient Greece as a quiet, serene world of white marble temples basking in the sun. But the Athens that a young man named Plato knew was a very different place. It was a loud, messy, and often chaotic city. It was the world's first great democracy, which meant it was a city of constant argument. The marketplace, the agora, was filled with the shouting of vendors, the endless debates of citizens, and the arguments of politicians trying to win a vote. It was a world of shifting opinions, where what was true one day could be false the next. Plato grew up in the middle of all this noise, and he had a teacher, a mentor, and the best man he had ever known, named Socrates. And then, when Plato was a young man, something happened that broke his world. The city of Athens, which was supposed to be a shining example of justice and reason, voted to execute the most just and reasonable man Plato knew. This event left Plato with a deep and a very unsettling question. If everything in this world is so flawed, so temporary, and so easily corrupted, if a just city can kill a just man, then where can we find anything that is truly real? How can we trust words like justice, or truth, or beauty, if they mean something different to everyone, every single day? This question started him on a great search. A search not for a new political system, but for something permanent, something perfect, something that existed far away from the noise and the dust and the arguments of his chaotic city. You don't need to answer these questions yourself. Your only job tonight is to relax and to listen to the story of this search. The story of a man who looked at a flawed and a very stressful world and dreamed of a perfect and a very quiet one. Let's begin our journey by trying to imagine the world that Plato was born into. Not the quiet, idealized world of museums and history books, but the living, breathing city of Athens as he would have known it. The center of this world was a place called the agora. To us, the word sounds ancient and formal, but in reality, it was simply the marketplace. It was the heart of the city, a sprawling, open space under the hot Greek sun, paved with stone and crowded from morning until evening. This was not a quiet or a contemplative place. It was a place of intense and almost constant noise. Imagine the sound, the constant, overlapping chatter of thousands of voices, the shouting of merchants selling their olives, their pottery, their fish, the haggling of customers trying to get a better price, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer from a nearby workshop, the bleating of a goat being led through the crowd. It was a place of raw, unfiltered, and unsleeping energy. But the noise wasn't just the sound of commerce. The noise was also intellectual. It was the sound of a new and a very radical idea in action, the idea of democracy. Athens was a city where the opinion of the ordinary citizen mattered. And because it mattered, everyone had one, and everyone was desperate to share it. The agora was the stage for this great, messy experiment. On any given day, you would see politicians standing on stone platforms, trying to win over the crowd with passionate speeches, their voices rising above the general din. You would see citizens gathered in small, intense groups, arguing about a new law, or a military campaign, or the guilt or innocence of a man on trial. Every single thing was up for debate. Nothing was settled. Truth was not a quiet fact to be learned. It was a prize to be won in a public argument. This was the air Plato breathed, an air thick with the dust of the street and the endless, shifting currents of public opinion. He saw how a charismatic speaker could sway an entire crowd, making them believe something was true one day, only for another, even more charismatic speaker to convince them of the exact opposite the next. He saw how easily people were persuaded by emotion, by flattery, by fear. And for a mind like his, a mind that was searching for something solid, something reliable, something you could truly stand on, this world must have felt deeply unsettling. It was like trying to build a house on constantly shifting sands. If the meaning of good could change with the mood of the crowd, then what did the word good really mean at all? If a law could be voted in one week and voted out the next, what was the real meaning of justice? This was the great, noisy puzzle of Athens. It was a world that celebrated the temporary, the changing, and the relative. And in the middle of all this sound and all this argument, Plato began to feel a deep and a quiet longing for the opposite. A longing for something silent, something stable, something that was true, not just for today, but forever. In the middle of this noisy, chaotic city of Athens, there was one man who, for Plato, represented the exact opposite of it all. This was his teacher, Socrates. Socrates was not a wealthy man, nor was he a powerful politician. He was just a stonemason who spent his days in the marketplace, not arguing, but asking quiet, persistent questions. He was, to Plato, the living embodiment of reason, of integrity, and of a deep, unshakable calm. He was a mind that did not bend with the political winds or the changing moods of the crowd. He was a steady, quiet anchor in a world of constant motion. And then, when Plato was in his late 20s, the city he lived in, the world's great experiment in democracy and justice, committed an act that, in Plato's eyes, was the ultimate and the most profound injustice. The city of Athens, the city that Socrates had served his entire life, turned on him. A few powerful men who had been made to look foolish by Socrates' simple questions, brought official charges against him. The charges were vague and unsettling. They said he was disrespecting the city's gods, and they said he was corrupting the minds of the young men who loved to follow him around and listen to his conversations. And so, Socrates was put on trial. The trial was not held in a quiet, solemn courtroom. It was a huge, public spectacle with a jury of 500 Athenian citizens. It was the chaos of the agora condensed into a single, high-stakes event. It was a battle of opinion, of emotion, and of persuasion. And Socrates, in his calm and rational way, refused to play their game. He didn't flatter the jury. He didn't beg for his life. He simply spoke what he believed to be the truth. And the jury, the citizens of Athens, voted. And they found him guilty. And then they voted again on his punishment. And they chose death. For Plato, this was not just the tragic loss of his teacher and his friend. It was a philosophical catastrophe. It was the moment the world stopped making sense. The very word justice seemed to shatter in his mind. The city of Athens had a legal system, it had laws, it had jurors, it had a process that it called justice. And this system, this thing that was supposed to be just, had just been used to kill the most just man he had ever known. This created a profound and a deeply unsettling problem for him. If the justice that existed here, in the physical world of men and laws, could produce such a terrible and an unjust result, then what was it? It must be a flawed and a broken and an imperfect thing. It must be a kind of shadow, a poor copy of something else. This event, more than any other, convinced Plato that you could not find real, true, perfect justice in this world. You could not find it in the laws of a city or in the opinions of a crowd. The justice of this world was a fragile and a corruptible thing. And so, he was left with a great and a haunting question. If true justice is not here, in this world, then where is it? And this question would set the course for the rest of his life. It was a question that forced him to start looking for another world entirely. A world that was not flawed and not changing and not temporary. A world where the idea of justice was real and perfect and eternal. Now, in this bustling city of Athens, there was a group of men who were not just a part of the noise. They were the masters of it. They were a new kind of teacher, highly paid and highly sought after, and they were called the sophists. And to understand Plato's deep need to dream of another, better world, we have to understand the idea that these men were selling. The sophists were, in essence, intellectual mercenaries. They were traveling teachers who would come to Athens and offer to teach the city's ambitious young men the single most valuable skill in a democracy, the art of persuasion. They taught rhetoric, the ability to stand up in front of a crowd or in front of a jury and make a convincing argument for anything at all. They taught you how to win, and they were very, very good at it. They were charismatic, they were clever, and they offered a clear path to power and influence. While Socrates was wandering around barefoot, claiming to know nothing, the sophists were accumulating wealth and fame by claiming to have the key to success. But underneath their practical lessons in public speaking, they were selling a much deeper, and to Plato, a much more dangerous idea. The core of the sophist philosophy was the idea of relativism. One of their most famous teachers, a man named Protagoras, had a phrase that summed it all up. Man is the measure of all things. What he meant by this was that there is no such thing as a real, objective, capital T truth. There is no such thing as a real, universal, capital J justice. There is only your truth and my truth. There is only what seems right to you and what seems right to me. And if I can convince 1,000 people that my version of the truth is better than yours, then for all practical purposes, my version becomes the truth. For a while, for Plato, who had just watched his mentor be condemned to death, this was a terrifying and a soul-crushing idea. Because if the sophists were right, then the execution of Socrates wasn't actually an injustice. It was just the outcome of a democratic process where Socrates' opponents made a more persuasive argument than he did. They won the debate. And according to this philosophy, that was all that mattered. This idea pulled the floor out from under his entire world. It suggested that the great words he had been taught to believe in, words like justice and truth and goodness and beauty, were just empty containers. They were just sounds that you could fill with any meaning you wanted, as long as you were clever enough to convince other people to agree with you. The world, according to the sophists, was a universe with no North Star. There was no fixed point to navigate by. There was only the endless, swirling chaos of human opinion. This was the intellectual swamp that Plato felt he was living in. The arguments in the agora, the shifting political alliances, the trial of Socrates, they were all symptoms of this deeper philosophical sickness. The world was not just noisy and chaotic, it was hollow. It was built on nothing solid. And this feeling, this profound sense of intellectual and moral vertigo, is what turned Plato from just a student into a true philosopher. He knew, with every fiber of his being, that this could not be the final answer. He refused to believe that the world was just a meaningless contest of opinions. He became convinced that he had to find that North Star. He had to prove that something real, something true, and something permanent existed somewhere. And he knew he was not going to find it here, in the noisy, dusty, and deeply unsettling world of Athens. So, let's try to imagine the state of this young man's mind. Imagine Plato walking away from the noisy, chaotic agora after another day of listening to the clever, hollow arguments of the sophists. Imagine him sitting in the quiet of an evening, remembering the calm, steady voice of his teacher, Socrates, a voice now silenced forever by the very city it sought to serve. He is living in a world that feels broken. The foundation has crumbled. The words that are supposed to be the bedrock of a good life, words like justice, truth, and goodness, have been revealed to be nothing more than shifting sands, their meaning changing with the breath of the most persuasive speaker. He feels a kind of philosophical seasickness. Everything is in motion. Everything is relative. Everything is uncertain. And in the middle of this deep and profound disillusionment, a new kind of conviction begins to form in his mind. It is not a political conviction. He is no longer interested in trying to fix the broken politics of Athens. He has seen where that leads. His conviction is much deeper. It is the conviction that this world of the senses that we see and hear and touch, cannot be the only one. It cannot be the real one. He began to look at the world around him with new eyes. He looked at a beautiful flower in a field, and he thought, yes, it is beautiful today, but in a week it will wither and die. Its beauty is temporary. It is fleeting. He looked at the strong, muscular body of a young athlete, celebrated by everyone in the city, and he thought, yes, he is strong today, but in time, his body will grow old and weak and frail. His strength is not permanent. He looked at a law passed by the Athenian assembly, a law that everyone today agrees is just, and he thought, yes, it seems just today, but I have seen how quickly the mood of the crowd can change. In a year, they might see it as unjust and repeal it. Its justice is not eternal. He realized that everything in this physical world, everything we can experience with our five senses, shares the same fundamental flaw. It is all subject to change, to decay, and to death. It is all imperfect. It is all temporary. And therefore, he reasoned, it cannot be what is truly, fundamentally real. Because for Plato, the word real meant something very specific. Real meant unchanging. It meant permanent. It meant eternal. And so, he began a great, quiet, and internal search. If the real is not here, in this world of the senses, then where could it possibly be? He started to think about a different kind of knowledge. He thought about geometry. Think of a perfect circle. You can imagine a perfect circle in your mind. It is a shape where every single point on its edge is exactly the same distance from its center. It is a perfect, flawless idea. Now, try to draw that circle on a piece of paper or in the sand. You can get close. You can make a very good-looking circle, but it will never, ever be perfect. Your hand will shake. The line will be a little thicker in one place than another. The physical circle you draw is just a flawed, imperfect copy of the perfect idea of a circle that exists in your mind. And he thought, what if everything is like that? What if the beautiful flower that I see in the field is just an imperfect, temporary, and dying copy of a perfect, unchanging, and eternal idea, the form of the flower that exists somewhere else? What if the just law is just a flawed copy of a perfect form of justice? This was the great turning point in his thinking. He realized he had been looking in the wrong place. Everyone in Athens was obsessed with the world of the senses, the world of politics, the world of physical things. But Plato decided to turn his gaze away from that world. He was going to dedicate his life to a new kind of journey. A journey not outward, into the noisy world of men, but inward and upward, into the quiet, silent, and perfect world of ideas. He was going to try and find a way to see, not with his eyes, but with his mind, this other, better, and much, much realer world. So, Plato was now faced with a very difficult problem. He was completely convinced that this world we see and touch is not the real world. He believed that it was a flawed, temporary, and a deeply deceptive place, and that a much realer, more perfect, and eternal world existed somewhere else, a world that you could only see with your mind. But how could he possibly explain such a strange and a radical idea to other people? If you have spent your entire life believing that the physical world is the only world, how could anyone convince you otherwise? He knew he couldn't just explain it with a logical argument. He needed something more powerful. He needed a story, a metaphor, a thought experiment that could gently guide a person's imagination from one way of seeing the world to another. And the story he came up with is perhaps the most famous and the most enduring allegory in the entire history of philosophy. It is known as the allegory of the cave. He asks us to imagine a group of people living deep underground in a vast cave. These are not visitors. They have been here for their entire lives. They were born in this cave, and they have never, ever seen the light of the sun or the world outside. And their situation is even more specific than that. Since birth, they have been prisoners. They are sitting on a low bench, facing a flat, smooth wall at the back of the cave, and they are chained in place. There are chains around their legs and chains around their necks, and these chains hold them so securely that they cannot turn their heads. They cannot look to the left or to the right. They cannot even see the other prisoners sitting beside them. They can only ever look straight ahead at the wall that is directly in front of them. This is the entirety of their world. The feel of the cold stone beneath them, the hard metal of the chains, and the sight of this flat, blank wall. This is their entire reality. They have no memory of any other place. They have no concept of another way of being. Now, behind these prisoners, and completely unknown to them, there is a low wall. And behind that wall, there is a large, bright fire, which casts a flickering light throughout the cave. And all day long, other people, the puppeteers, are walking back and forth along the top of this wall. And these puppeteers are carrying things. They are holding up carved, wooden figures. A figure of a tree, a figure of a dog, a figure of a person. And the light from the fire catches these figures, and it casts their moving shadows onto the flat wall that the prisoners are forced to watch. So what do the prisoners see? All they see, all day long, is a silent, flickering parade of dark, flat shapes moving across the stone wall in front of them. They see a flat, gray shadow that looks like a tree, and they hear the other prisoners give it a name, tree. They see a flat, dark shadow that looks like a dog, and they learn to call it dog. And this is the most important part of the story. For these prisoners, these flickering shadows on the wall are not a trick. They are not a representation of reality. For them, the shadows are reality. It is the only reality they have ever known. The idea that these shadows are just imperfect, flat copies of some other, more real, three-dimensional object would be an impossible and a crazy thought for them. They would believe, with absolute certainty, that the world is a silent, two-dimensional, and shadowy place. And they would spend their entire lives studying these shadows, becoming experts on them, learning their patterns, and believing that this was the highest form of knowledge. Let's stay inside this strange, dim world of the cave for a little while longer, and try to imagine what life would actually be like for these prisoners. It's easy to see them as foolish, but Plato's point is that their world, in its own way, would be completely coherent and internally consistent. The prisoners would have a culture. They would have a society. They would develop a kind of science, a field of study dedicated entirely to the world of the shadows. They would become experts on this flickering reality. Imagine a young prisoner learning from an older one. The older prisoner would point at the wall and say, "Watch. After the shadow of the triangle, the shadow of the circle always appears." And the young prisoner would watch, and he would see that this is true. A pattern. He would learn to predict the movements of the shadows. There would be contests. The prisoners would test each other on their knowledge. They might ask, which shadow will come next? Or how many times has the shadow of the bird appeared today? And the prisoner who was the best at this game, the one with the sharpest eyes and the best memory for the patterns of the shadows, would be hailed as a genius. He would be seen as the wisest and the most knowledgeable person in the entire cave. He would be given honors. He would be seen as the person who truly understands the nature of reality. And they would have a language, but their words would be tied only to this shadowy world. When they used the word tree, they would not be talking about a real, living thing with bark and leaves and roots. They would be talking about a flat, dark, two-dimensional shape that flickers across a stone wall. Their word, tree, would refer only to the shadow, because the shadow is the only tree they have ever known. This is the crucial and the most unsettling part of Plato's allegory. The prisoners are not unhappy. They are not sitting there, longing for another world. How could they? They have no concept that another world even exists. They are completely and utterly convinced that their world of flickering, flat shadows is the one and only reality. They do not know that they are prisoners. They do not know that they are in a cave. They believe they are free, and that they are seeing the world exactly as it is. And this, for Plato, was a perfect metaphor for the human condition. He looked at the people in the noisy agora of Athens, arguing about politics and fame and money, and he saw these prisoners. They believed they were talking about real things. They used big words like justice and beauty and goodness. But Plato believed they were only talking about the shadows of these things. They were arguing about the specific laws of Athens, which were just a flickering, imperfect shadow of true justice. They were praising a beautiful statue, which was just a temporary, flawed shadow of true beauty. They were the experts of a shadow world, and they were completely unaware of it. They were mistaking the copy for the real thing. And just like the prisoners in the cave, they would likely become very angry and very hostile toward anyone who tried to tell them that their entire reality was an illusion. They were comfortable in their chains, and they were proud of their knowledge of the shadows. And for Plato, this was the great, tragic, and deeply sleepy state of ordinary human life. Now, let's leave the prisoners for a moment, still chained to their bench, still watching their familiar parade of flickering shadows. Let's turn our attention to the part of the cave that they cannot see. Let's explore the machinery that is producing their entire reality. Behind the prisoners, Plato asks us to imagine a low wall running parallel to their bench. He describes it as being like the screen that puppeteers use to hide behind, so that the audience can only see the puppets they hold up. And behind this wall, a very different scene is unfolding. There is a large, crackling fire. This fire is the only source of light in the entire cave. It is a kind of artificial, man-made sun, casting a warm, but an unsteady, glow. And walking back and forth along the top of this low wall, with their bodies hidden, is a procession of people, the puppeteers. And these puppeteers are not just walking. They are carrying objects. These are not real, living things. They are artifacts, carved and crafted objects designed to look like things. They are holding up a wooden carving of a tree, a stone statue of a dog, a metal effigy of a man. They are carrying all sorts of man-made representations of the things that exist in the world outside. And as they walk, the light from the fire catches these objects, and it is the shadows of these puppets that are cast onto the wall for the prisoners to see. The entire reality of the prisoners, their whole world of flat, flickering shapes, is nothing more than the shadow of a puppet. Now, this is the next, and a very important, layer of Plato's thought. What does this world of the fire and the puppets represent? For Plato, this represents the physical world that you and I experience every single day, the world of our five senses. The puppeteers are holding up a wooden carving of a tree, and that, for Plato, is like the real, physical tree you might see in a field. The statue of a dog is like the real, living dog you might have in your home. The fire in the cave is like our sun in the sky, the source of light that allows us to see this physical world. This world is, of course, much more real than the world of the shadows. A three-dimensional wooden tree is certainly more real than a flat, gray shadow of a tree. A living dog is more real than a shadow of a dog. To be able to see this world would be a huge leap in understanding for the prisoners. But, and this is the crucial point for Plato, even this world, this physical world of trees and dogs and people that we think is so real, is not the final reality. It is still a world of copies. It is still a world of imperfections. It is still a world that is trapped inside the dim, flickering light of the cave. Why? Because the real, physical tree that you see in a field is still a temporary and a flawed thing. It will grow, it will change its shape, and one day, it will wither and die. It is not permanent. The dog will get old and sick. The beautiful statue will eventually crumble. Nothing in this physical world lasts forever. Therefore, Plato reasoned, these physical things themselves must be just another kind of copy. They are better, more convincing copies than the shadows, but they are copies nonetheless. The wooden puppet of a tree is a copy, and the real tree in the field, because it is temporary and imperfect, must also be a copy of something else. A copy of something even more real, something permanent, and something perfect that exists somewhere completely outside of this cave of our senses. Now, if a person has spent their entire life inside this cave, first watching the shadows, and then perhaps even being able to see the puppets and the fire, a very deep and a very difficult question would arise. How could you ever possibly know that there was anything more? If your entire experience of the world is limited to what you can see and touch within these stone walls, how could you ever even begin to imagine that a world outside the cave even exists? This was a serious problem for Plato's philosophy. It's one thing to say that our world is just a shadow play, but it's another thing entirely to provide any proof, or even just a hint, that there is something more real. And Plato found his first, and his most powerful, clue in a place that has no physical substance at all. He found it in the quiet, in the perfect, in the absolutely unchanging world of mathematics. Let's imagine one of the prisoners, a very thoughtful one, still chained to his bench. He is watching the shadows flicker across the wall, and he starts to notice the shapes. He sees a shadow of a perfect square. He sees the shadow of a triangle. He sees a perfect circle, and he starts to think about them, not as shadows of things, but just as shapes. Now, someone can show him a shadow of a circle and another shadow of a circle, and both are just flickering, imperfect, temporary things. But his mind can begin to grasp the idea of the circle itself, the pure idea. He can begin to understand, just with his own power of reason, the concept of a perfect circle, a shape where every single point on its circumference is the exact same distance from the center. Now, he has never seen a perfect circle, not in the shadows, not anywhere. Every physical representation of a circle is, and will always be, slightly flawed. It will be a little bit wobbly, a little bit imperfect. And yet, his mind, his power of pure thought, can understand the idea of a perfect, flawless circle. This is a profound realization, because where does this idea of a perfect circle exist? You can't point to it in the cave. It's not a physical thing. It doesn't grow, it doesn't change, it doesn't decay. The idea of a perfect circle is not temporary. It is eternal. It is the same today as it was yesterday, and as it will be tomorrow. It is a small piece of unchanging, perfect reality. For Plato, this was the key. He saw mathematics and geometry as a kind of window, a small crack in the wall of the cave that allowed a little bit of the light from the real world to shine through. He realized that our minds, our power of reason, have the amazing ability to grasp these perfect, eternal truths, even while our bodies are trapped in the world of imperfect, temporary things. The truths of mathematics don't come from our five senses. You don't learn that 2 + 2 = 4 by looking at it, or by tasting it. You understand it with your mind. It is a different kind of knowing. And this led Plato to a powerful conclusion. If our minds can grasp the reality of a perfect circle, which is not a physical thing, then perhaps our minds can also grasp the reality of other perfect things. Perhaps there is a perfect, unchanging idea of justice that our minds can understand, even if we only ever see its flawed shadows in the world. Perhaps there is a perfect, eternal idea of goodness that our minds can reach for, even if the world around us is full of imperfection. Geometry, for Plato, was the first step. It was the training ground for the soul. It was the way a prisoner could begin to turn their mind away from the flickering, deceptive world of the senses and toward the quiet, stable, and much, much realer world of pure ideas. Now, Plato asks us to imagine something truly extraordinary happening inside this dark and familiar cave. Imagine that one of the prisoners, who has spent his entire life chained to that bench, is suddenly and inexplicably set free. His chains fall away, and he is not just released. He is compelled by some unseen force to stand up and to turn around. Let's just pause for a moment and imagine the sheer, disorienting shock of this first movement. For his entire life, His reality has been defined by the feeling of the chains, the stillness of his body, and the flat, two-dimensional world of the shadows on the wall. The simple act of turning his head, of seeing the world in 3 dimensions for the first time, would be a profoundly painful and a terrifying experience. His eyes, which are accustomed only to the dim, gray flicker of the shadows, would immediately be met with the bright, dazzling light of the fire behind him. And what would be his first instinctive reaction? It would be pain. His eyes would ache. He would be blinded by the glare. His first impulse would not be to rejoice in this new, brighter world. His first impulse would be to turn back, to return to the familiar, comfortable, and painless darkness of the shadow world he has always known. And now, imagine this unseen force continues to compel him. It drags him, against his will, past the low wall where the puppeteers are walking. He would see, for the first time, the carved, wooden objects they are carrying. And someone might try to explain to him, this is the real tree. The thing you were watching on the wall was just its shadow. But would he believe it? Plato thinks not. His entire life has taught him that the flat, gray shape on the wall is the tree. This new, 3-dimensional, colorful object would seem strange and confusing and less real than the familiar shadow. He would still believe that the world he knew was the true one, and this new world was some kind of strange and painful illusion. And now, the journey becomes even more difficult. The unseen force does not stop. It begins to drag this confused and frightened prisoner up a long, steep, and rugged passageway, leading out of the cave entirely. The climb is difficult. The rocks are sharp. He stumbles and he falls. And all the while, he is fighting, and he is struggling, and he is begging to be allowed to return to the simple, predictable world of the bench and the shadows. For Plato, this difficult and painful journey represents the process of true education. It is not a pleasant or an easy thing. To learn, to truly learn, means to be dragged away from our comfortable and familiar opinions. It means to be forced to question the very foundations of our reality. And our first instinct is always to resist. We cling to our comfortable shadows. We defend the reality we have always known. The journey toward wisdom is a struggle against our own deepest instincts to stay in the dark. And finally, after this long and painful climb, the prisoner is dragged out of the mouth of the cave and into the world above. And what is the first thing that happens to him? He is completely and utterly blinded. He has spent his entire life in the dim, flickering light of a fire. And now, he is standing under the full, brilliant, and overwhelming light of the sun. The pain would be immense. He would be able to see nothing at all. He would be a helpless, stumbling, and a completely disoriented creature. The new, real world would, at first, be a world of pure, white, painful light. He would have no way of making sense of it, and his only desire would be to crawl back into the gentle, familiar darkness of the cave he has always known. So, our freed prisoner is now standing at the mouth of the cave. He is not joyful. He is not enlightened. He is in a state of profound and painful confusion, blinded by the brilliant, overwhelming light of the sun. He cannot look at anything directly. The reality he has been dragged into is, at first, completely inaccessible to him. Plato understood that the journey to wisdom is not a sudden flash of insight. It is a slow and a very gradual process of adjustment. Your eyes and your mind have to slowly become accustomed to a new and a much brighter kind of reality. So he asks us to imagine how this man would begin to see. At first, he would only be able to look at the ground, and even then, he would only be able to look at the most indistinct things. He would look at the shadows. He would see the shadow of a real tree cast by the real sun. And this would be a familiar and a comfortable first step. He is an expert in shadows, after all. And then, as his eyes begin to adjust, he might be able to look at the reflections of things. He might look into a still pool of water and see the reflection of the tree the reflection of the sky, the reflection of his own face. And this would be the next step. A reflection is more real than a shadow. It has color, it has more detail, but it is still not the thing itself. And then, slowly, gently, as the pain in his eyes subsides, he would be able to lift his gaze. He would be able to look directly at the physical objects of this new world. He would see a real tree for the first time. Not a shadow, not a reflection, not a wooden puppet. A real, living, breathing tree with its textured bark, its thousands of individual, rustling leaves, its deep and complex roots. He would see a real animal, a real flower, a real human being. And the experience would be one of overwhelming awe. He would realize that the carved wooden puppet of a tree inside the cave was just a crude, lifeless, and a pathetic copy of this magnificent, living reality. He would realize that the entire world of the cave, the shadows, the puppets, the fire, was just a dim, flickering, and a deeply impoverished imitation of this vibrant and a very real world. And this, for Plato, is what it is like for a philosopher to begin to see the world of the forms. The world outside the cave is the world of pure, perfect, and eternal ideas. The real tree that the prisoner is now looking at, as beautiful as it is still just one, single, temporary tree. It will one day die, but as he looks at it, his mind is able to grasp the idea of tree-ness itself, the perfect, unchanging, and eternal form of the tree, of which this physical tree is just one example. He is no longer seeing with just his eyes. He is beginning to see with his mind. He is beginning to understand that for every category of things in the physical world, there is a single, perfect, and unchanging form in this higher, more real world. There is a perfect form of a dog, which is the ideal that all the imperfect, temporary, physical dogs are based on. There is a perfect form of a human being, a perfect form of a house. This is the world of true reality for Plato. It is not a physical place. It is a realm of pure, intellectual understanding. It is a world that is completely silent, completely stable, and completely perfect. And the journey out of the cave is the journey of the soul, turning away from the distracting and deceptive world of the senses and learning, slowly and gradually, to see the quiet, eternal, and beautiful reality of the forms. Let's stay here for a moment, in this bright, quiet world outside the cave, and try to understand this strange and a very beautiful idea of the forms a little more deeply. Because this is the very heart of Plato's dream. It is the destination that his entire philosophy was trying to reach. And the best way to grasp it is to take one simple example and look at it through his eyes. Let's take the tree that our freed prisoner is now looking at. Imagine it in your mind. It is a specific, individual, physical tree. Perhaps it is an old, gnarled oak tree. Its bark is rough and deeply grooved. One of its branches has been broken off in a storm. Some of its leaves are green and healthy, but others are yellow and beginning to fall. It is a living, breathing thing, but it is also, by its very nature, imperfect. It is not a perfect specimen of an oak tree. It has flaws, and, most importantly, it is temporary. It is in a constant state of change. It grew from a tiny acorn. It is now in its mature stage, and one day, inevitably, it will wither, decay, and die. It exists in time. Now, for you and me, and for most of the people in Plato's Athens, this physical, living tree is the most real kind of tree there is. We can see it, we can touch it, we can smell it. It is a solid, tangible fact. But for Plato, this was not the case. For him, this temporary, decaying, and imperfect oak tree was less real than the idea it was based on. He would ask us to now think, not with our eyes, but with our minds, about the idea of a tree. Not a specific tree, but the concept of tree itself, the eternal blueprint. He would call this the form of the tree. What are the qualities of this form? First, it is perfect. The form of the tree contains the essence of what it means to be a tree in its most complete and flawless state. It doesn't have any broken branches. It doesn't have any dying leaves. It is the ideal, perfect pattern of a tree. Second, it is unchanging. The physical oak tree is changing every single second. It is growing, it is shedding leaves, it is aging. But the form of the tree, the idea of what a tree is, does not change. It was the same 1,000 years ago as it is today, and as it will be in 1,000 years. It exists outside of time. And third, it is eternal. The physical oak tree will die, but the form of the tree, the very concept of treeness, will never die. It is a permanent feature of reality. So, Plato comes to a very strange and a very radical conclusion. He says that this physical oak tree, the one that we can see and touch, is actually just a pale, flickering, and a very poor copy of the truly real thing. And the truly real thing is the perfect, unchanging, and eternal form of the tree that exists only in that higher realm of pure ideas. The physical tree is like a shadow on the cave wall. It's a better, more convincing shadow than the ones the prisoners were watching, but it is a shadow nonetheless. And the real object, the object that is casting that shadow, is the form. And he believed this was true for everything. The chair you are sitting on is just an imperfect copy of the perfect form of a chair. The feeling of love you have for a specific person is just a temporary and a flawed reflection of the eternal and perfect form of love. And this is why he was dreaming of this other world. Because our world, the world of the senses, is a world of constant change, decay, and death. It is a world of things that will always, eventually, disappoint us and disappear. But the world of the forms is a world of perfect, eternal stability. It is a quiet and a solid and a deeply peaceful place where nothing ever fades and nothing ever dies. So, we have spent a little time now with this idea of the forms, using the simple and tangible example of a tree. We have seen how Plato would argue that the physical, temporary tree is just a pale imitation of the perfect, eternal form of the tree. This is a strange idea, but we can, with a little imagination, begin to grasp what he meant. But Plato was not a botanist. He was not ultimately concerned with the perfect nature of trees, or chairs, or any other physical object. These were just simple examples he used to explain his idea. His real search, the great and passionate quest of his entire life, was to find the perfect and unchanging reality behind the most important and the most abstract ideas of all. The ideas that had caused him so much distress in the noisy, chaotic world of Athens. The ideas of justice, of goodness, and of courage. Let's take the idea of courage as an example. This was an idea that the men of Athens were obsessed with. They were a society of soldiers and citizens who valued bravery above almost all else. But Plato, in his conversations, saw that no one could really agree on what it was. In the physical world, in the world of the cave, what do we see? We don't see courage itself. What we see are individual, specific, and often contradictory acts of bravery. Imagine a soldier standing in a line with his comrades, holding his shield steady as the enemy army charges toward them. He is terrified, but he does not run. And we look at him and we say, that is an act of courage. And this is true. It is a shadow of courage cast on the wall of our experience. But now, imagine a different scene. Imagine a lone citizen standing up in the Democratic Assembly, speaking an unpopular and a dangerous truth to a powerful and an angry crowd. He has no weapons, no shield. His body is not in danger, but his reputation, his livelihood, his entire social standing is at risk. And he is also terrified. But he speaks anyway. And we look at him, and we also say, that is an act of courage. And now, imagine a third scene. A mother sitting by the bedside of her sick child, day after day, week after week. She is not fighting an army. She is not speaking to a crowd. She is just quietly, patiently, and relentlessly enduring her own fear and her own exhaustion in order to provide comfort and care. And we look at her, and we also say, that is a profound act of courage. So what is the real courage? Is it the soldier's act? The politician's act? The mother's act? They are all so different. And each one is an imperfect and a temporary event. The soldier might be brave today, but he might run in fear tomorrow. The politician might speak the truth this week, but he might lie next week to save his career. These are all just flawed, flickering, and temporary copies. They are all just shadows of the real thing. For Plato, this was the great problem. The men in Athens were arguing about the shadows. They were trying to define courage by looking only at its imperfect examples. But he believed that there must be a single, perfect, and an unchanging idea that all of these different acts are just copies of. He believed that there exists, in that higher, more real world, a perfect form of courage. This form is not an action. It is the pure, eternal blueprint of what courage itself is in all of its possible expressions. It is the ideal that the soldier, the politician, and the mother are all, in their own imperfect ways, trying to participate in. And Plato believed that a true philosopher, a true lover of wisdom, was not someone who was an expert on the shadows. A true philosopher was someone who turned their mind away from the confusing and contradictory examples of bravery in this world, and instead used their power of reason to try and get a glimpse of the perfect, and the silent, and the absolutely unchanging form of courage itself. Because only by seeing the real thing, he believed, could you ever truly understand all of its imperfect copies. But Plato, in his allegory, tells us that the journey is not yet over. There is one final, and most important, thing that the prisoner must learn to see. When he first emerged from the cave, he could only look at the shadows and reflections of things. Then, he learned to look at the things themselves. But there was one thing in this upper world that he could not look at directly at all, and that was the sun, the source of all the light that made it possible for him to see anything in the first place. He knew it was there. He could feel its warmth, but its brilliance was still too overwhelming for his unaccustomed eyes. This is the very peak of Plato's entire philosophy. He believed that all of the other perfect forms, the form of justice, the form of courage, the form of beauty, the form of a tree, all of them were connected. They all received their reality, their goodness, their very existence from this one, ultimate, all-encompassing form. Just as the physical sun in our sky gives the light that allows all living things to grow and to be seen, the form of the good is the ultimate source of all reality and all truth in the universe. This is a very abstract and a very difficult idea, and it is meant to be. It is not something you can easily grasp with a quick, logical argument. It is something that can only be understood after a long, slow, philosophical journey. But what does it mean for us as we lie here, looking for a little bit of quiet? It means that, for Plato, the universe, at its deepest and most fundamental level, is not a chaotic or a random or a meaningless place. He believed that the very fabric of reality, the source of all existence, is something that is perfectly and eternally and absolutely good. The messy and the painful and the unjust things that we see in our daily lives, the shadows in the cave, are not the final reality. They are just a dim and a distant and a very flawed reflection of a source that is pure and untroubled. And so, to be a philosopher, for Plato, was to make this final turn of the soul, to turn your mind's eye away from the darkness and the confusion of the cave, away from the specific problems and the anxieties of your own personal life, and to instead try and catch a glimpse of this ultimate, and this silent, and this completely peaceful source of all things. It is a state of mind that is beyond words. It is a quiet and a wordless contemplation of something that is perfectly true and perfectly beautiful and perfectly good. And in that contemplation, Plato believed the soul could find its ultimate home, a place of absolute peace, a place of profound and unshakable calm, a place where all the questions are answered and all the striving is finally and completely at an end. This is the final destination of the philosopher's dream. We have now traveled with Plato all the way to the very peak of his philosophical vision. We have stood with him, in our imaginations, outside the cave, gazing at the perfect, unchanging, and eternal source of all reality, the form of the good. It is a place of profound and absolute peace, a place of silent, timeless perfection. Let's try to feel the world through his eyes for a moment. He looked around at his life, at his city, at the people he knew, and he saw a world that was fundamentally untrustworthy. First, there was the stress of impermanence. Think of the pain that comes from loving things that you know will not last. Plato felt this with a profound intensity. He saw the beauty of a young, healthy body and knew that it was already, in that very moment, beginning the slow, inevitable process of aging and decay. He saw the joy of a close friendship and knew that it could be ended in an instant by a disagreement, or by distance, or by death. He saw a beautiful work of art and knew that the stone would one day crumble and the paint would one day fade. For a mind that longed for stability, this world of constant change and loss was a source of deep and unending sorrow. It was a world where every hello contained a hidden goodbye. Then, there was the deep mental exhaustion of uncertainty. Think of the feeling of trying to navigate a city where all the street signs are constantly being changed. This is what the intellectual world of Athens felt like to him. The sophists had taught that there was no true north, no fixed point of reference for truth or goodness. And Plato saw the consequences of this all around him. He saw men who were celebrated as heroes one day and condemned as villains the next. He saw ideas that were considered brilliant one year and foolish the next. To live in such a world required a constant, tiring, and ultimately fruitless effort of trying to keep up. It was a world that offered no solid ground for the mind to rest upon. And finally, there was the simple, aching dissatisfaction of imperfection, the constant, nagging feeling that things are just not quite right. It's the feeling of seeing a law that is supposed to be just, but knowing that it has loopholes and that it can be applied unfairly. It's the feeling of seeing an act of bravery that is still tainted by a small amount of selfishness. For a mind that could conceive of perfection, the perfect circle, the perfect idea of justice, to be constantly confronted with the flawed, messy, and not quite rightness of the physical world was a kind of constant, low-level pain. This is why the world of the shadows, our everyday world, felt so stressful to Plato. It was a world that was beautiful, but ultimately tragic. It was a world that was intellectually stimulating, but ultimately exhausting. It was a world that was full of potential, but always fell short of perfection. And this is why his dream of another world was not just an idea. It was a refuge. It was a sanctuary. It was the only place his mind could go to be free from the pain of change, the exhaustion of uncertainty, and the ache of imperfection. It was his homecoming. And it is in that quiet, stable, and perfect world that he invites us, too, to finally find our rest. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey tonight. We have walked with Plato through the noisy, chaotic streets of his city. We have sat with him in the darkness of the cave, watching the flickering shadows on the wall. And we have made the long, slow, and difficult climb up into the bright, silent, and peaceful world of the forms. We have come to understand that this elaborate and this beautiful philosophical dream was not just an intellectual exercise for him. It was a sanctuary. It was a place of profound and of necessary refuge for a soul that was deeply troubled by the flawed and the chaotic and the constantly changing world of our everyday experience. And now, he offers this sanctuary to you. As you lie here, at the end of your own day, a day that was no doubt filled with its own collection of imperfect shadows, he invites you to perform one last, gentle, and quiet act of philosophy. He invites you to turn your mind's eye away from the cave. The cave of your daily experience is now closed for the night. All of the flickering shadows from your day, the imperfect conversations, the unfinished tasks, the small anxieties, the fleeting pleasures, all of that has come to an end. The puppeteers have gone home. The fire has died down to embers. The walls of the cave are now dark and silent. There is nothing left to see there. There is nothing left to analyze. So, let's gently, in our imagination, leave that world behind. And let's allow our minds to rest in the thought of this other world. The world that Plato dreamed of. A world that is not made of matter, but of meaning. A world not of noise, but of a deep and a resonant silence. I want you to just imagine, for a moment, what it would feel like to inhabit such a place. A reality where everything is perfectly and eternally calm. Imagine the feeling of a mind that is no longer being pulled in 1,000 different directions by the changing moods and the shifting opinions of the world. A mind that is not struggling to keep up or to figure things out, but a mind that is simply resting in the presence of something that is eternally and unshakably true. Imagine the feeling of a heart that is no longer aching with the fear of loss or the pain of imperfection. A heart that is not bracing against the inevitable decay of all the things it loves, but a heart that is quietly contemplating a reality that is perfectly and eternally good. A reality where nothing beautiful can ever fade and nothing true can ever be lost. This is the ultimate comfort that Plato's philosophy offers us. It is the permission to believe that the chaos is not the final reality. The stress is not the final reality. The imperfection is not the final reality. The final, the truest, and the most real state of the universe is a state of perfect, silent, and unchanging peace. You do not have to struggle to get there. You do not have to climb out of a cave. In this final moment, you only have to allow your own mind to become a quiet reflection of that world. You can let go of the specific, flawed, and temporary thoughts from your own personal day, and you can just allow your awareness to rest in the simple, vast, and silent idea of a perfect calm. Let that be the place where your mind spends the night, not in the noisy, flickering world of yesterday's shadows or tomorrow's uncertainties, but here, in the quiet and the stable and the deeply peaceful world of the eternally real. Let your mind rest in Plato's dream. And in that quiet and in that stillness, allow your body to follow. Allow yourself to find the deep and the perfect and the untroubled rest that you deserve. And so, the story is complete. The journey is over. The great and beautiful dream of the philosopher has been dreamed. The cave is now dark and silent. The shadows have all faded. The fire has gone out. The voice of Plato, the quiet questions of a man from a long-ago city, can now fall silent. His work is done. He has shown us the path out of the cave, and he has pointed our gaze toward the sun. And the voice that has been speaking to you, the voice that has been your companion on this journey, its work is also done. It was only ever meant to be a quiet guide, a gentle hand to lead you to the entrance of this silent, peaceful place. And now that you are here, it can fade away like a distant echo, leaving no trace behind. Let all the words and all the ideas and all the allegories dissolve. Let go of the cave and the prisoners and the forms and the sun. They were just pointers. They were just fingers pointing at the moon. And now, you can forget the finger and just rest your gaze on the quiet, silvery light. The great comfort of this philosopher's dream is simple. The noise is not the final reality. The imperfection is not the final truth. The deepest and the most real thing, the source of all that is a perfect and a silent and an unchanging peace. There are no more ideas to understand now. There is no more history to learn. There is only the simple, physical reality of this moment. The feeling of the warmth of the blankets around you. The feeling of the softness of the pillow beneath your head. The gentle, heavy feeling of your body, finally letting go, finally being supported. There is nothing you need to hold on to. There is nothing you need to figure out. There is only this quiet. There is only this stillness. There is only this peace. This is the real world that Plato was searching for, not in some distant, intellectual realm, but here, in the simple, profound, and untroubled silence of a mind that has finally, truly, come to rest. So rest here now. Rest in this quiet. Rest in this peace. Just rest.